Okay, let's go ahead and get started. We're just a minute or so after 7, but I want to be really respectful of everybody's time. So thank you for joining us. And tonight's a great presentation with a great partner of mine, Sam Vakili. He's going to be talking about the difference between RSP, TFSA. Right now is a time that everyone should be really looking at just their overall financial picture, doing some planning. That's what Sam's really good at. But we often get a lot of questions. I mean, even as a mortgage specialist, I get this question about what's the difference between an RSP and a TFSA and a RIF and a this and a that. So Sam tonight is going to just address some financial planning stuff and the difference between an RSP and a TFSA, when you want to use it, when does it matter, that sort of thing. So without any further ado, Sam, over to you, my friend.
Thank you, Stephen. I can see we have a handful of people in here right now. So I know this is it's not necessarily engaging in the sense that it's going to be a monologue type of scenario. But at the end of this, if there are any questions, by all means, we'll leave our contact information. Feel free to reach out and ask us anything that you might want to take away or get more knowledge on. So as Stephen was mentioning, our big focus today is talking about RSPs and TFSAs. And the reality is that bucket, or those buckets rather, of portfolio accounts, the same principles we apply here, and sorry, I have a cat that keeps trying to run across my screen here. The same principles apply to the other types of accounts that exist as well. And we'll kind of get into them just a little bit, but without getting too deep into it. So, the main question that we get asked as financial planners is, do I have enough money? How much do I need? When can I retire? These types of questions come up time and time again. And I wish that I could give people a black and white answer, but it is very gray and it's very circumstantial, because everybody has a different goal financially. And for some people, you can achieve that earlier, and for the others, it's later. So determining yourself when you sit down what's important to you and what you want to achieve, especially as you get closer to retirement, those are the first building blocks for you to take to your advisor or just between your family to determine, when will I actually need to retire? And then we can at least start to reverse engineer what retirement will look like and whether or not you have sufficient money. I don't want you to walk away thinking there's no way to answer that question, because there is. It's just that we usually need more information before we can actually give you a final answer. So just a quick agenda on what we're going to talk about here today. The first piece is trying the qualitative stuff, and then we get more into the quantitative, what to expect, what to be mindful of, and all of that jazz. So the first thing that you'll always hear a planner talk about is determining those goals. What do you want out of your future? And it doesn't have to be necessarily a retirement goal. It could be paying off student debt or even going to school. It could be buying your first house, buying a rental, getting married, going on vacation. The list goes on and on. But determining what your goal is, that measurable goal is the starting point that you're going to need to start to determine how we can achieve that goal. And obviously, the more measurable you make it, the easier it's going to be for you to quantify. And then when we get that information, we want to get a bit of a sense as far as you as an individual, what type of style are you comfortable with? There's a textbook answer that we usually default to, but everybody has this difference about themselves, this emotional piece that you can't necessarily just pull a textbook answer and put it in front of everybody. Because if you have a long time horizon, sure, the textbook answer is you can be invested with more volatility, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the right thing to do. Because if you're not comfortable with that volatility, then you're not going to be able to stay the course, especially when we see pullbacks like lately, 2018, especially the second half. Actually, really the whole year had a lot of turbulence, and it starts to show people's true colors. 2017 was a great year. I've never had a client come in and say, oh, I made too much money. That's just never been a conversation. But on the flip side, when you see your portfolio statement pull back 1, 2, et cetera %, that's when you start to realize, hold on, am I really in the right type of portfolio? So that's where that comfort that we talk about, that risk reward, that balancing act between the two is really, really paramount. Because like I said, if you pull your money out, those years after a downturn and a recession are usually where we see the bounce back. And if you don't stay the course, you're not going to rebuild. You're always going to be chasing that initial investment that you had. So talk to your advisor, talk to your family, make sure you really quantify what risk looks like. A lot of times it's just a conversation about, well, I'm a balanced person or I'm a growth person or whatever, but what does that mean in number terms? And we try to go through that with our clients to say, here's some perspective on what a conservative portfolio should try to attain or expect versus a fully growth type of investor. And to that point, obviously, the more risky you are, generally speaking, the more stock-based or the more equity-based your portfolio is, excuse me. And the more conservative you are, the more bond-based or potentially the more GIC-based your portfolio is going to be. You know, the old mindset of bonds don't necessarily move too much. They are interest rate sensitive, but they don't tend to move too aggressively compared to, you know, stocks are trading every single day in market open to close. So that volatility can be minute to minute or second to second at times. So the important stuff here to be mindful of is when you get closer to retirement, there's going to be a series of different types of sources of income. And this is where we're going to try to explain why a TFSA and an RSP is important in different stages of your life. Because if you look at this screen here, there are quite a few income sources that you can expect depending on the type of individual you are. The two top ones that I put that have the asterisks is, the reason why I put them is because generally speaking, those are your potential foundation when you get closer to retirement. Generally speaking, every Canadian resident will get an old age security and a Canada pension plan. If you work for a company, you may also get a pension. It could be defined benefit, it could be defined contribution. We're not going to get into that today, but that's generally what we call the foundation or the baseline of your retirement income. And then we try to supplement that with the things on the rest of the page, the RRSPs, the spousal RRSPs, the tax-free savings accounts, etc. And using all those pieces moving together is how we try to determine when to use an RRSP versus when to use a tax-free savings account. You know, the main registered accounts that we think about are the tax-free savings, the registered retirement savings plan, which also goes in line with the spousal plan. And then if you do have kids, or if you know somebody who qualifies for the disability tax credit, that's where our ESP and our DSP also come into play as well, but we're not going to touch on them too much today. So just a quick refresher on the RRSP. Be mindful that it builds up on an annual basis, and the general calculation is 18% of your income. Now, there is a threshold, and that moves up every year a little bit. This year, that number is 26.5. Last year, I think it was 26.2, and I'm sure next year it'll go up a little bit more. But the reason why that's important is because there is a moment where you cap out. And for anybody who's in that 125-ish range, you're probably hitting the maximum that you're going to be able to earn from an RRSP contribution room limit on an annual basis. And that's a very important piece, which we'll come back around to, because if you don't necessarily use it this year, it does carry forward to the next year, which is really, really useful because it doesn't force you to use your RRSPs every single year. Be mindful, the big benefit, the reason why we all get excited about the RSP, especially at this time of year, be mindful, the deadline is March 1st, is because whatever you put in, you're going to get back as a refund from the government, assuming that you've overpaid taxes. So it's nice. You get a nice check around May-ish when you file your taxes, but it isn't necessarily the right thing to do every single year. Now, I will put a caveat to that if you are under a pension program through your employer, those are generally speaking a great program to max out because of the free contribution that you're getting back from the company. That matching portion is, I mean, it's free money. So you may as well max it out while you can. But again, it's always, I put a disclaimer, talk to your advisor, make sure, just 100%, but generally that is the case. So that money grows, it builds, and then eventually you're going to pull it out. And there are a few ways to pull it out that don't necessarily line up with retirement. And the two big ones are your home buyer's plan and your lifelong learning plan. So there are limits to each of those as far as how much you can take out. The home buyer's plan is a $25,000 limit. Now, if you have a spouse or a common law partner or whatever it is, you can both pull it out. Or anytime you go joint on a house, that's where you can look to do that. Now, the lifelong learning plan is slightly different. It can be used for continued education, and $20,000 can be withdrawn. However, you can only pull out $10K per year. And both of them have a repayment schedule, the home buyer's plan being a 15-year and the lifelong learning plan being a 10-year. So those are ways to access the money before you get to retirement, which is a great way, especially for those that are trying to buy their first house. You know, you can borrow money against what you put in. So you put money into the RSP, you get a tax refund from the government, which is great. And then you can take that money out of the home or the RSP for your home buyer's plan and use it towards your first home. So be mindful, it is for the first home. That term first home is a bit of a misnomer because you can qualify again for a first home, but I'm not going to get too deep into that. Stephen would be the right person to ask about that later as well. So that's the RRSP. Now you can take those same principles and you can apply them to the spousal RRSP. And the idea here is that if there's a disparity in your income between partner A and partner B, there may be value in making RSP contribution in a spousal form with the intention of reducing the higher income earners taxable bracket, but still moving over the assets into the lower income earners portfolio. And the reason we generally do this is to create equilibrium. You know, you don't want to be at a point where you're closer to retirement and one person has a very, very large portfolio and the other one has a much smaller one. That disparity can come back to be slightly challenging when it comes to tax time. So that's just a quick idea of what an RRSP entails. And then
Sam,
as a comparison, sorry, go ahead, Stephen.
It's a really great comment. Just to give a real life example, I know my wife and I do that. So just to give and I didn't know much about spousal RSPs because I just do mortgages all day long, but it was great for us to give a good example on that. We had, so the way we look at it, the way we explain it to our friends, you know, is that my wife, who makes less than I do right now on taxable income, she gets the tax benefit now. And then I will get the tax benefit now. It's my contribution. She gets the RSP money, and then she gets the benefit later when she takes it out. She's a lower tax bracket. So I know when I tell my friends, it's an awesome way to do it. And it's a good way, just like you said, equilibrium to your overall tax situation. So I just wanted to jump in there because I know it's been awesome for my wife and I, and it's a great solution. So thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a perfect example. And you know, there are other ways to use your RRSP, and we're not going to get into it today, most likely, because it gets a little bit more intuitive, but don't think about an RRSP as only being able to be used for your retirement. There are ways to make withdrawals from RRSPs. You know, one thing I'll tell clients is, especially when they're on the mortgage side, is, you know, that second house, that third house, you can think of your RRSP as a way to offset some of that gain. That's something we've done in the past. Or another scenario is, if you're some clients go on a leave of absence where they don't work, or they go on sabbatical, or they go on mat leave, or whatever that scenario is, you can still pull money out of an RRSP in those years. Now, I'm not suggesting that you necessarily do that. However, it is still an option, especially in a scenario where your taxable income is lower, right? That's the whole idea with the RRSP is take out or put the money in, when you're in your highest brackets and take it out in your lowest. So back to the TFSA to jump around. I know we're kind of going back and forth, but the TFSA is another great vehicle that is offered to us by the government. It's similar to an RRSP in that it's a registered account, but the benefits are a little bit different. So instead of that 18% that we talked about building, there's a limit for every Canadian that is a resident after 2009, as long as you're 18 years of age. So right now, anybody who's been 18 or over since 2009, they'll have a total lifetime contribution of $63K. And if you're younger than that, then you can subtract the years that don't apply to you, but that number continues to grow. And just like the RRSP, if you don't use it every single year, that's perfectly fine. It carries forward and you can use it in future years. Now, the really interesting thing about a TFSA is that you can take money out. So it's liquid in a certain sense. You can access it and you don't give up that contribution room. You can always put that money back in a future calendar year. That rule does not apply with an RRSP. If you put money in and you take it out, you forfeit that room. However, on the flip side, you can do that with a tax-free savings account. Now, the other benefit is that there's no tax on the growth. So the beautiful thing here is any growth that occurs is all yours. You know, you don't have to worry about when I take the money out, am I going to have to claim the tax or anything to that regard? The answer is no. It's your money. You can use it as you wish. And the other thing is there's no upper age limit. And the reason why I put that in there is because there is a moment where you can no longer make RRSP contributions, and that is the year where you turn 71. That's the final year. Whereas with a tax-free savings account, you could be 72, 75, it really doesn't matter, and you can still qualify to put that money in. Now, I will say the one piece that's important, and I didn't used to talk about this until I realized it does affect some more people than I probably gave it credit for, is having money in your tax-free savings account will affect your ODSP if you qualify. There are limitations under the ODSP, and they've actually changed last year as far as how much you can have in savings in order to still qualify for that. And I should mention ODSP is the Ontario Disability Savings Plan. So if you're somebody who does qualify for that, or you know somebody that does, don't just jump the gun and use the tax-free savings or the RRSP. It could negatively impact them technically. So the main part that I wanted to talk about here, especially since we're talking about TFSAs and RSPs, is which one is the most useful and when to use them. And the reality is, if you suspect that you're the type of individual who's going to be building their income, and you think that in future years you're going to have a much higher tax bracket or a much higher income bracket than you're at right now, then the question you need to determine is, do I use the RRSP now or later? And the simple idea there is that if you make 50,000, you pay X. And if you make 100,000, the amount that you pay per dollar is actually higher. So when you put that money in the 100K bracket into an RRSP, you get more money back from the government dollar for dollar. So I don't want to discourage people who are not at their peak earning years to use an RRSP, but the real question is it the most sensible for you? Because the opportunity cost is that foregone tax, that difference. And if you allow your RRSP to build, like we said, it does continue to build, it carries forward. So on your line 150, on your notice of assessment on the 5th page, you'll see a bolded number at the bottom, and that number is your carry forward room. And it just keeps building. So if you now get to your peak earning years and you have cash flow, you can put in a large contribution into your RRSP in those high peak earning years in an effort to offset the tax when it's the most painful, really, the most expensive. So that's where using your RRSP aggressively in your early years may not necessarily be the most sensible decision, especially because the tax-free savings account allows you to put the money in. It's liquid. In a worst case scenario, if there's an emergency, you can access it. You don't forfeit it. And let's say you don't have an emergency and it just keeps building. Now, when you get to those peak earning years, you can take a withdrawal out of your TFSA and you can move that exact money into your RRSP. And this way you're using both accounts together in an effort to make them as efficient as possible. So this is where you want to talk to your advisor to say, does it make sense to use one versus the other? Usually there's one that does more sense. And oftentimes we will build both of them up together, but contributing more to one may be more sensible rather than just going even into both or all of it into one. So that's where we really want to have that conversation today, to educate you, to say, okay, going forward, where do I see myself? Forecast where you see your career going, where you see your high income earning years, and apply to things like rental income. You know, a lot of people will buy a second, a third, a fourth home. And when you do that, that income still counts towards your final taxable income, especially if you sell one of those homes down the road. Your primary residence, you never get hit with tax, which is great. But anytime you buy that second house, it's a cottage, it's a rental, it really doesn't matter what the scenario is. Those ones will be taxable in your name in the year where you sell them. So sometimes letting your RRSP build up, that carry forward room, build up so that the year where you sell your house, you can make a large offsetting contribution so that you don't pay tax on that portion of the house. So, you know, there are intuitive ways to use an RRSP and a tax-free savings account. Don't assume that it has to be used only for retirement and only for your employment income. You know, that's where you want to work with somebody to determine what is the appropriate direction to take. So we'll come back around to the RESP and RDSP. Before we get into them, what I wanted to be mindful of is all of these accounts that we're talking about are like umbrellas or buckets. You know, inside of them, you can do whatever you want. You can leave them in cash. You can invest them in GICs, mutual funds, index funds, ETFs, stocks, bonds. The list goes on and on. So you don't have to think of either of those accounts as an investment per se. It's an account where you can decide what type of investment you'll hold. So when you think about savings, that's it's really not invested in any way other than just it goes into the account. And usually we'll suggest this for anybody who wants a liquid access to the account. If you're planning to take money out, okay, great, you can use your savings. But if you do plan on investing it for anything longer than, you know, a couple weeks or a couple months, I would really suggest you look at something else, even if you are risk averse, because you're leaving money on the table. And remember, inflation is approximately 2%. So if your savings account makes you 1%, you're still leaving a little bit of a real loss technically on the table. Now, that's where a GIC comes into play. And this is for the type of investor who's really not comfortable with any downturn. They want that capital preservation. They want the security. They want to know exactly how much they're going to have at all times. And it's a really useful tool, not only for the risk averse, but for those that have a very short-term goal. So one thing we haven't talked about right now is time horizon. You know, when we have a client that is looking at a goal that is less than 5 years, we don't generally suggest any kind of market exposure because of that volatility. So that's where a GIC comes into play. If your goal is to buy a house in 2 years or to retire in 3 years, and you know there's a portion of that retirement you need access to, you do need to start considering GICs as a part of your portfolio. You know, it's not going to give you that high octane growth that some people are used to from the 80s and 90s, but it will still give you at least enough to keep up with or beat inflation a little bit. Now, mutual funds are slightly different in the sense that you're going to get some exposure to either stocks or bonds, or most often both. And that's where you want to make sure that you determine where you're comfortable. That was what we talked about at the beginning of this presentation. You know, do I like how much risk, how much exposure I have? Because you don't want to be in a scenario where you feel anxious or uncomfortable with the type of holdings that you do have. So one last thing that I do want to go through right here is the RESP and the RDSPs, just since we did go through the list. Those are other registered accounts that give you other types of benefits. We talked about the RSP and TFSA in depth. The RESP is a great way to put money in for your kids or other family members' education with the way of getting a bonus, so to speak, from the government in a grant or in a bond. And so I'm not going to get too granular with that today, just for the sake of information overload. But if you do know that that is your goal, there are other ways to save for it, like education savings plans. And if you do know somebody that is qualified for the disability tax credit, this program is incredible. I don't think enough people know about it. The grant and the bond that you get from the government here is insane. You can get upwards of 300% depending on your income bracket. So if you know anybody that has this, and it's not something that you necessarily have to be born with, it can happen over the course of your life. As soon as you apply for that disability tax credit and you are granted it, you should talk to somebody at your institution about making those contributions as well. So that's pretty well what we wanted to talk about as far as the different types of investments. You know, one saying that I really love is never test the depth of the river with both your feet. So if you're not necessarily accustomed to these discussions or these portfolios, you can kind of get your feet wet, or at least 1 foot wet, and try it out. There are many, many different avenues to take with it. The direct investing approach, what we call the investees, which is an ETF type of portfolio, working with people in the branch, whatever way you're most comfortable with, go with it. You can use more than one if you're still learning. Really, the world is your oyster. So in an effort to keep things relatively short and sweet today, I think I'm going to conclude it there. And by all means, if you have any questions for either Stephen or I, feel free to reach out. We'll leave our email here for you guys to send us an email or give us a call at your convenience.
Hey, Sam, you all done?
Indeed.
All right, perfect. Well, everybody, thank you very much for attending. We will have the recording of the video up very soon, probably within a week or so. So we'll make sure we get that out to everybody. And if you have any questions, you know where to find Sam and I. By all means, reach out. And until next time, talk to you soon.